The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Natural Bridges Media or KSQD's staff, volunteers, or underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Talk of the Bay. I have three guests today who have been involved in a project to remove 3 dams on the lower Klamath River. Mark Rockwell is a retired doctor of chiropractic who practiced in the San Francisco Bay Area until 2000. He became involved in the Klamath settlement process in 2003 while working with the Northern California Council Fly Fishers International as their VP of Conservation. He has been part of the Fishery Conservation Stakeholders Group since the beginning, except for a 2-year leave in 2015 and 2016. During this time, he also worked for the Endangered Species Coalition from 2005 to 2017, working on national and California endangered species and fishery watershed issues. He's married with 3 grown children and now lives in Santa Barbara, California. Mark Rockwell, welcome.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Craig Tucker started Suits and Signs Consulting in 2018 to provide professional advocacy and campaign planning services to tribes, local governments, and nonprofits, working to protect watersheds and advance the principles of social justice. Craig's career in advocacy began after earning an advanced science degree, then realizing that data alone will not address the social and environmental crises many communities struggle with every day. Craig's approach to social change was shaped in part by his year-long training with Green Corps, the most respected school in the country for environmental organizing. However, the most profound lessons he learned over the past 20-plus years of advocacy were taught by the tribal members, fishermen, and farmers of the Klamath Basin. The Klamath may be the most respected school of hard knocks in the country. The passion, dedication, and wisdom of the colleagues, friends, and mentors Craig was lucky enough to cultivate working on the Klamath inspires everything that he and his colleagues do at Suits and Signs. Craig Tucker, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And finally, we have with us Mark Bransom. He is CEO of the Klamath River Renewal Corporation, and we'll find out more about that as we go along. For those who haven't seen the news, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, approved a plan to remove 4 hydroelectric dams on the lower Klamath River, returning some 400 miles of river to natural flows. And demolition of the dams is supposed to begin next year. So I wondered if I could start with you, Craig, and ask you why are the Klamath dams being removed?
Well, there's actually a pretty good list of reasons, but number one is no one really wants them anymore. The company that owns them has agreed to the removal. Dams were built. Most dams in America were built either sort of Depression era or again in the Eisenhower era, and most of them are really at the end of their lives, their engineering lifespans. So in order to operate these dams to the future, it would require a lot of repairs to the dams, modifications to the dams so they could comply with modern environmental laws. And so a lot of that's really expensive. So part of the equation here is economic. It would operating these dams into the future be worth it. And we've been making the case for years that they would not be worth it. And that coupled with a lot of advocacy by tribes and fishermen and conservation groups led to the agreement for the company Pacificor to give up these dams and move them in order to restore hundreds of miles of historical spawning grounds and habitat to salmon.
And I understand this salmon runs that historically have occurred on these rivers have been really important to the tribes that have lived along those waters for millennia. What's going to be the impact of the dam removal for fish coming back? And I'm going to ask you, Mark, as a fisherman, if you could talk about that some, about what's the impact really on the fisheries there?
Well, I think we can basically predict, at least, that the impact on the fishery is going to be substantial. The Klamath River historically was the third largest salmon steelhead river in the lower 48 states, behind the Columbia Snake River system and the Sacramento San Joaquin in Central California. So this is a historic river that had at one time millions of fish returning every year to spawn in the upper tributaries of the river system itself. And because of the dams that we're talking about that are going to be removed, that access that you referred to earlier as 400 miles of habitat, it was basically cut off. And for most of the fish, that means really the end of their life. I mean, the spring run Chinook salmon, which was historically the largest population of Chinook salmon in the system, were completely cut off of their needed headwater fisheries in the higher elevations of Oregon in particular. And that species of Chinook salmon is much different than the fall runs that we now have in the river, because it requires over summering in the freshwater system itself, coming into the system in the spring, hence they're called spring run. They come into the freshwater in the spring, but they don't spawn until October, November. So those fish were completely cut off and extirpated from the upper basin. And that was the largest run of fish. They were supplemented by hatchery-based fall run Chinook below Iron Gate Dam, but that never even came close to equaling what they were historically. So the other population of fish that we're involved with fly fishing is the steelhead, which were historic in the Klamath at one time. The Klamath, along with some other rivers of what's called the Lost Coast of California, including the San Lorenzo, frankly, and Santa Cruz, were part of this historically known steelhead salmon fishery in the northern California coast, including the Klamath. So, that fishery has been less than 10% of its historical norms since the dams went in. So we see this as a huge opportunity for the fish just simply to reestablish themselves and get back to the best level they can, given the other changes that have occurred in the basin, which are substantial.
Who's going to be regulating fisheries once the dams are out and the fish begin to come back?
Well, the regulatory agencies for both the state of California and Oregon, of course, will be regulating take and fishing times and that kind of thing, as well as the National Marine Fisheries Service, and to some extent the Fish and Wildlife Service, but mostly National Marine Fisheries Service. And so there's two federal agencies and two state agencies that will really be involved in overseeing both the recovery as well as the sustainability of those fisheries.
I wanted to get into the background a little bit of this effort. How long has the effort to remove the dams been going on? How long has it taken to get to this point? And any of you?
Yeah, I would just offer, so tribes living on the Klamath River have been fighting dams as long as white people have been on the Klamath River trying to build dams. And there were proposals for more dams than are currently there over the years that were fought back by both tribal communities and fishing communities over the years. But it was really in the late 90s, tribal leaders knew that the license to operate these dams was going to expire in around 2004. I think it was the license expiration. And so tribes started mustering the resources, doing the research, getting ready for that moment, because when the license expires and FERC sort of referees this process to get a new license, that's really your moment, your opportunity to remove dams or change how dams are operated or modify the dams. And so tribes are really prepping for that for probably over a decade in anticipation of the license expiration in 2004.
All right. So this is taken, I mean, if that license expiration was 2004, and it was really just, I believe, early November that FERC finally approved this plan. Is that right?
Yeah, it's been a lot of years. I think some of us didn't really appreciate we'd spend, the bulk of our adult lives working on Klamath Dam removal, but there's folks who have spent, I've been working on this since 2003 or 2004. The folks I work for, there are people who spent their entire lives working on this, and it took everything we had. I mentioned that at the end of the day, the dams are not particularly valuable as an economic asset, but that did not diminish the fight that a lot of folks had to keep these dams in place. And so it took a movement that included rowdy protests at board meetings of companies that own the dams and the companies that own the companies that own the dams. It took a lot of litigation. It took a lot of good science. And it took direct lobbying. It took it all. Every tool in the toolbox, every tool in the activist toolkit was applied here on the Klamath to get us here.
And just a quick digression there, but you mentioned the companies that own the companies. I guess Pacific Corp owns these as hydroelectric power sources. Is Pacific Corp in turn owned by something else, someone else?
Oh, yeah. So when this fight started, Pacific Corp was owned by a Scottish multinational energy company called Scottish Power. And so in 2004, we really kind of kicked off our campaign to bring the salmon home in earnest by about 30 tribal members flying to Edinburgh, Scotland to crash the shareholders meeting of Scottish Power. And we did that 3 years in a row. And we thought we may win this battle in Edinburgh, Scotland. People in Scotland were pretty disappointed to know that a Scottish energy company was responsible for hurting the cultures of Native American people here in the States. But instead, Scottish Power sold Pacific Corp to Berkshire Energy. And so Warren Buffett has ultimately been the owner of this project since about 2006 or 7. And so this led tribes to then protest in Omaha, Nebraska at the annual Berkshire Hathaway shareholders meeting for a number of years. So there's a lot of that kind of direct action and activism that was the underpinnings of this effort getting started.
And are there other environmental benefits besides for fisheries in removing the dams?
These dams, the reservoirs behind these dams erupt with massive blooms of toxic algae every summer. They've been listed as a health hazard. Almost every summer there are signs placed around these reservoirs and in the river downstream of these dams warning people not to touch the water because of the toxicity. It's a blue-green algae called Microcystis aeruginosa. So there are a lot of human health risks that go along with these toxic algae blooms. But water quality and fisheries are the two big factors driving this.
And the other thing I'd like to throw in on this too is kind of a subtle reality, because you asked the question, are there other environmental benefits? And the reality is that Chinook salmon and what are called anadromous fish, which are fish that live in both the ocean and the fresh water and the river systems, bring aquatic and ocean nutrients into the upper basins of these watersheds that are key to the establishment of tree and shrub growth, as well as Chinook salmon, we know, benefit over 300 different species of wildlife living in these watersheds. So it's an exchange of nutrients that are needed in the environment in those watersheds, as well as providing food and sources of energy to many other types of wildlife, eagles and bears and marmots and all kinds of other wildlife, including small crustaceans and things that live in the water that the fish and others live off of while they're there. So there's a huge cascading impact to the natural ecological health of the entire aquatic system when these fish are allowed to thrive in the entire watershed.
And what happens to the algae bloom when you restore the free flow of the river? Does that disappear, or how does that affect it?
Yeah, well, these algae blooms are a consequence of the water being stagnant, the water getting really hot in the summertime, and the Upper Klamath Basin, it's a volcanic system. So the Klamath is what we call a hypereutrophic system, which means there's a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus in the system as a consequence of this sort of volcanic geology of the upper basin. Historically, there were massive wetlands in the upper Klamath Basin that consumed a lot of these nutrients. Unfortunately, a lot of those wetlands were destroyed to make way for agriculture and ranching and farming. So when the water gets trapped behind these reservoirs and it's full of nitrogen and phosphorus, the sun comes out, everything gets hot. It's sort of the perfect ideal condition for these massive blooms of toxic blue-green algae. Through dam removal, you'll get rid of the stagnant water. You won't have this warming effect, and we expect these algae blooms to really diminish or go away entirely.
Great. So, Mark Bransom, I want to ask you, since you're the CEO for the Klamath River Renewal Corporation, could you first give us a little background about the creation of the KRRC, and then I want to ask you more about the plans for the demolition of the dams?
Well, sure. Much of the time that elapsed between the expiration of Pacific Corp's hydroelectric operating license and the mid-November approval by FERC of the surrender order was spent developing a settlement agreement among a large number of parties who came together to drive toward dam removal. And the formation of the Renewal Corporation was an outcome of the 2016 amended Klamath Hydroelectric Settlement Agreement, the KHSA. That settlement agreement contemplated the formation of a nonprofit dam removal entity that would be responsible for utilizing the available funding to secure all the necessary permits and comply with all the relevant laws, and ultimately to hire engineering contractors and construction contractors and restoration contractors for purposes of developing all the plans and ultimately removing the dams and restoring the footprints through the hydroelectric reach of the river. And that's the point where we have now arrived. And so we're in the process of preparing to mobilize those contractors to get started early in 2023 for purposes of doing the early construction work that will lead to the removal of the 4 dams, presumably, according to our current schedule, by roughly the end of 2024.
Great. That's a pretty fast timeline. I mean, you're talking 4 complete dams to be removed. And that's a lot of concrete and steel to come out of there.
Yeah, that's right. And a lot of earthen material as well. But that's exactly the reason why we hired a world-class civil infrastructure contractor in Kiewit and a world-class restoration contractor, Resource Environmental Solutions. Both of these contractors are experts at precisely this kind of project. We've worked through excruciating levels of detail on precisely how the project will be implemented. And everybody stands ready to get this underway. So we'll get mobilized on the site and get started in 2023. We've got about 8 or 9 months of early construction work that has to be done just to prepare us for the drawdown of the reservoirs, followed by the removal of the dams. So as soon as the weather allows us to get on site, we'll get started with the road and bridge improvements, the relocation of hatchery operations, the relocation of a water line that serves the city of Wairika, and then a number of modifications to the dams themselves so that we are then prepared to begin in early January of 2024 to evacuate the water and the accumulated sediment from behind the dams, and then follow that with the removal of the dams in the summer and early fall of 2024.
That's a huge undertaking.
Enormous.
If you're just joining us, my guests are Mark Bransom, Craig Tucker, and Mark Rockwell. They have all been closely involved with a project to remove 4 dams on the Klamath River, which was just approved last month, the final approval for that project by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. You've been doing a lot of planning for this in process. Things are really starting to move forward. And there's been other dams removed in the country. One I'm aware of is the Elwha Dam up in Washington State. And there's been sort of dire predictions, oh, this is going to have some terrible downstream effects, or the sediment is going to cause problems at the river deltas where they enter the ocean, et cetera. And those predictions have not turned out to be as bad as, well, they haven't turned out to be bad at all. They've actually turned out to be very positive. And I wondered if you could talk about what's expected here in terms of downstream effects for water quality and for sedimentation.
Yeah, well, every dam removal project is unique, and certainly the Klamath Dam Removal Project has a number of features and characteristics unique to the landscape and unique to the facilities, and therefore unique to both the removal and the restoration of the river afterwards. But we appreciate that the Klamath River, like many of the other systems where dams have been removed, is a highly resilient system, as are the fish and the other species that reside there. And so we have a great deal of optimism that given time, the river will restore the balance that has been missing. With regard to the sediment evacuation, we see a significant amount of sediment that has accumulated behind the dams over the last 100 years since the river has been effectively shut off from its natural recruitment and transport of sediment. But I think it's important to note that the amount of sediment that is expected to be released when we actually do the sediment mobilization and flushing is not more than what the Klamath River will ordinarily transport in any given year anyway. Now, we will be releasing that amount of material in about 4 months. So it is a little bit concentrated with regard to time. But again, the amount of sediment is essentially equivalent to that the Klamath River is accustomed to seeing move through the system each and every year anyway. So it's not a particularly large amount of sediment. It's very fine material. Generally, it's expected to remain suspended in the water column, and over the course of 1 to 2 years, move all the way down through the system to the Pacific Ocean and out into the marine environment. I had the opportunity just a couple of months ago to stand at the delta on the Elwha River, where that sediment, in fact, deposited, as you suggested, in an alluvial fan, where Dungeness crab had not been present and reestablished themselves along that sediment. A very surprising benefit that was not anticipated by very many people during the contemplation and the monitoring after the dam removal. So would we expect to see something like that on the Klamath? I don't know, but it's just another example among many examples where these resilient systems and the species that live in and among these systems find a way to take advantage of the new conditions. And really what we're trying to do here, we're doing a resiliency project. This is creating conditions that allow these amazing species and human communities to restore the balance that has been thrown out of whack by the presence of these dams. It's going to be unique. We certainly are gleaning lessons from these other dam removal projects, but we recognize that this one is independent of those. It's unique, but we, as you have said, have done an incredible amount of planning and a lot of anticipating conditions that we may see. So I'm confident that we stand ready to address anything that we see come along, and we're very excited about the potential outcomes from this work.
That's great. I know that tribes have been involved a lot in this work, and Craig, you've helped represent them in some cases as part of this process. Could you talk, Craig, a little bit about how this has progressed and what this means for the livelihoods and the economics of those tribes that have depended on the river historically for fish?
Yeah, sure. So just so your listeners know, I am not a member of any of these tribes, but I've worked here for a couple of decades, playing a role as an ally and an advocate for the tribes. And I think the big thing for tribes on the Klamath, and I think throughout Indian country, the Pacific Northwest, where there's salmon, is that salmon are really fundamental to the cultural identity of Native folks that live on these rivers, like the Klamath and the Columbia and the Snake. So I've had Yurok elders and Karuk elders, tell me the story of how they were put here on this earth to be stewards of the river, be stewards of these fish. And when there's no more salmon, there'll be no more need for Karuk people or no more need for Yurok people. So for the tribes, this is truly an existential crisis to solve. It's just fundamental to their culture and cultural identity to have these fish available. These fish, religious ceremonies, the timing revolves around the timing of returns of the salmon. Salmon are a sacrament in a lot of ceremonies, so it'd be like Christians trying to have mass without the wine and the crackers. You need your sacraments there to make these ceremonies work. So it's really important. So I think that's first and foremost. And secondly, these are rural communities that are some of the poorest communities today in California. And the opportunity to have ecotourism for Yurok, they have a commercial salmon fishery that they've not been able to operate for several years because of low returns of salmon to the Klamath Basin. So the economics are real, but I would say everybody I know who's Karuk or Yurok or Hupa would tell you first, it's not about the money. This is about who we are as a people. And I just can't overstate that point to your viewers.
Yeah, thank you.
I'd just like to maybe say a little something about the economics on the other side, maybe to the towns and cities and communities along the Klamath River. I'm an avid steelhead fisherman all over the Pacific Northwest into British Columbia and Alaska. And I go to British Columbia every year, have for the last 34 years, at least 1 week, usually 2 weeks a year. And I know that many friends of mine and people that I know from the West Coast here, Idaho, Oregon, Washington, and California, go to British Columbia to fish the large steelhead of that Skeena system there, which is somewhat like the Klamath. It's long and has lots of tributaries. And they spend between $8,000 and $12,000 a week to go to lodges, not counting flights in or rental cars or food that they may buy otherwise. So the return of the Klamath fishery itself, just as a sport fishery, which is typically catch and release for all wild fish in the state of California, would be a really highly beneficial long-term benefit to the cities and towns and communities, including the tribes along the river, because we go through tribal lands to fish. So, I think if we could get this restarted, it will be a huge long-term economic benefit to everybody, as well as this cultural and religious benefit that we all feel in some way or another, not nearly as strongly as the tribes do. But when you're a fisherman who loves the outdoors and you're standing in a river watching a deer come down to drink or an eagle on the bank, you have a real reverent experience, and it's one that we miss.
I think it's also relative to point out that here locally I'm in Arcata, California, and down the street here at Wild Bears Market, you can get wild line caught salmon, and it's about $23.99 a pound. I think last time I was in there. Mm. If you do the math, that means every one of those salmon is more valuable than a barrel of oil. So salmon are have an economic value that goes beyond you wanting to do the right thing, have a healthy environment. Support our obligations to tribes to maintain their cultural resources, have something to do to go fish and go on vacation, that stuff. But these fish are really valuable. Salmon mean business. And California once had a thriving commercial salmon industry that's been crippled by the way we've managed water in this state and allowing to build dams throughout this state. So there's a lot of reasons to restore salmon, and good old-fashioned economics is one of them.
Yeah, it's huge. We're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back with my guests with more about the removal, this really epic event of removal of dams that have been in place for, in some cases, over 100 years on the Klamath River in Northern California. If you're just joining us, my guests are Mark Bransom, the CEO of the Klamath River Renewal Corporation, Craig Tucker, who has been an advocate for restoration of the Klamath River, and Mark Rockwell, who has worked with fisheries and fishing organizations as well on restoration of the lower Klamath, with a removal of 4, not 1, not 2, but 4 dams on the lower Klamath. Craig, you were emphasizing some of the economic benefits of the removal of the dam, particularly in fisheries. It sort of pops into mind, well, what are the impacts? We're losing the hydroelectric production. How does that affect Pacific Corp's power supply, and does that affect the price of energy for their customers?
Well, one reason why we've gotten to dam removal relates to the dams not being very effective power generators. These are hydroelectric dams, but they're pretty darn old. The amount of electricity they make is almost noise on the grid relative to the rest of Pacific Corp's power generating assets. And it doesn't really do any good to put power on the grid that's not cost effective. And so, what the California and Oregon Public Utility Commissions determined throughout the course of this battle was that removing these dams is cheaper for Pacific Corp's customers than paying the cost of relicensing the dams and modernizing them and continuing to operate them. So, this is really a decision that is in the public interest in every sense of the word, including the public's economic interests.
That's great. That's encouraging, because you think when you stand next to a place like that, especially if you see the flow through a powerhouse, and you always think, well, wow, that's a lot of water moving through there. But it's all relative. So, yeah. And I understand that the flows on the dams and the sedimentation has affected how much power they produce too. That it's actually often declines to next to nothing by the end of the dry season. Is that true?
Well, a lot of dams do fill in with sediment that impacts their ability to, run water through turbines and things. I'd say that's not so much the case here, but because this is a salmon-bearing stream and a really important salmon-bearing river, you can't just shut off the river and save up the water and let it out all at one time. You have to maintain flows in the river for fish, and that challenges your ability to make as much electricity as you want. Back before we had environmental laws to protect fish, dam operators had a lot more flexibility in how they operated their projects. But as fisheries across the West have declined, we've had to change how we operate dams, and that certainly affects dams' ability to generate electricity. Luckily, we have a whole new suite of technological advances to address our energy needs. Floating offshore winds coming to California. In Lawrence Livermore Labs yesterday, apparently they pulled off nuclear fusion for the first time. So I think we're going to find cleaner and cleaner ways to make electricity to power the nation that doesn't force us to compromise clean air or clean water.
Yeah. Did these dams play any role in flood control for the river basin?
Mark? Actually, they do not, Len. The dams exist for the sole purpose of spinning turbines and producing hydroelectric power. And you ask a very important question. We're often asked, will the removal of these dams have any impact on our important food producers? And the answer is no. There is no water stored in these reservoirs for agricultural uses. The dams are not operated for flood control. While because of their sheer size, the reservoirs can provide a short amount of detention time for incoming flows. They're not operated to provide flood control benefits, as are many dams on other systems. So the removal of the dams is not expected to impact any agricultural users or municipal water users, nor is it expected to have any major implications with regard to flooding or flood control. It's important to recall that the operation and control of flows on the Klamath River currently exists and will continue to exist, at least for the time being, at the Link River Dam, which is the structure that forms Upper Klamath Lake in Oregon. And that dam will remain for the time being, and thus the operation of the river and the control of major flood flows and other operational considerations is not impacted by the removal of these dams, and we still have that control point at the Link River Dam. That facility, of course, will be undergoing some further improvements to ensure that there is adequate fish passage both upstream and downstream. So that when the Klamath hydroelectric dams are removed, the dams upstream will not serve as any form of an impediment to the movement of the fish that are expected to return. So no flood control, no municipal water users, no agricultural water users, and work to be done to ensure the ability of fish to move up and down the system at will.
Well, that's interesting that they're going to make improvements to the Link River Dam, Upper Klamath Lake, of course, being a very large reservoir. So that this means with the removal of these dams and also the improvements to the Link River Dam, that the fish can get even further up, not just up to the Link River Dam, but beyond it. Is that right?
That's absolutely right, and others can speak to this, but I'm aware that the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife has already undertaken pilot studies to better understand how fish will move not only through the lake, but in and out of the tributaries to Upper Klamath Lake. That's obviously a very important factor in the recovery of the fish. So a lot of work already going into better understanding that. And of course, that information presumably will be available to fisheries managers, fisheries biologists for purposes of improving habitats and doing other work that may be necessary to improve the conditions. I'm sure that Mark and Craig can add to that.
Well, I would just add that we understand that Upper Klamath Lake, I mean, it's not a reservoir in the sense it's not a man-made lake. It's a natural lake, and it drains the Upper Klamath Basin. This big, it's really desert up there. It's really dry up there, so it drains this vast area into what were these magnificent wetlands historically on the Upper Klamath. And so that's a natural feature that fish navigated historically. So we know fish navigated Upper Klamath Lake. They spawned and reared in the Williamson, the Sprague, and the Wood River systems. Salmon never cease to amaze me, and I think people should appreciate that. Salmon may pull off the greatest migration on planet Earth. The distances they travel, the elevations they climb. I would say spring Chinook salmon may be the best athletes on Earth if you watch them navigate rapids and waterfalls and other obstacles. And so they climbed 4,000 or 5,000 vertical feet up in the Klamath Basin historically. And
Wow.
We think there's a future for that to happen again.
Wow, that's impressive.
I think another comment is on the often not stated fish that comes just like the salmon do, which is the Pacific steelhead, which is really a rainbow trout that goes to the ocean. And for generations now, the rainbow trout that are trapped in Upper Klamath Lake have still been using the tributaries like the Williamson and the Wood and the Sprague to go to spawn in the fall and spring. And those fish still carry the genetic material necessary to create an anadromous steelhead. So there's every reason to believe that once they have the ability to go to the ocean, some of them will, instead of going north into the Williamson or the Sprague or the Wood, they will actually go downriver into the Pacific, like they historically used to do. And we saw that in the Elwha River within 2 years of the dams coming out there, that steelhead that hadn't been seen in years were moving up the river, and a completely lost run of summer run steelhead reappeared there within 4 years. So I think, the reality of it is, I think most people today want to get in balance with nature, and really that's what this project is all about. It's getting ourselves as human beings back into balance with the natural system that we all live on and with. And I think this is just the steelhead or the salmon are metaphors for our own movement back to where we belong.
Yeah, Mark Rockwell, you had alluded earlier to all the other species that are dependent on the fish. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the diversity of different species of fish. There's steelhead, there's the coho salmon. What other creatures might we see start to rebound once these natural systems of the Klamath are restored?
Well, I think Craig can speak to this because I know the tribes are really connected to the eels that are in the river that come up and down the river on a constant basis. And I think those eels are, again, a not often talked about species, but the eels of the river are a really important species that, again, bring nutrients into the system. They bring food sources into the system, and they are food sources for tribal players or people up in the basin itself. Beyond that, the nutrients that come, provide food sources for over 300 species for sure. And steelhead are no different than that because only a small number of steelhead actually can survive. But steelhead can survive, unlike salmon. The Pacific salmon come into the system, spawn, and die. Steelhead can actually come into the system, spawn, and return to the ocean. So some of them will go back to the ocean, although it's an arduous travel, as you can imagine. 400 miles up the river and 400 miles back down the river is a trek. But it's a wonderful system when you see it, because those nutrients feed the trees, the plants, the animals, the birds, the bugs. Everything in the system benefits from the nutrients that come in from the marine system itself. In the Central Valley of California, scientists have isolated the gene structure of salmon in grapes and trees in the Sierra as well as in the Valley of California. So, when you get into science, like I spent my whole life in biological sciences with my chiropractic doctor's degree, the reality of it is everything in the system is important. And you can't start pulling pieces out without having negative impacts. So what we're trying to see here is a return of that balance that once was there that produced millions of salmon and steelhead every year.
Yeah, it's definitely an interconnected and interdependent system.
Absolutely.
And we're finally beginning to get that for rivers and forests and every other kind of habitat. I wanted to ask you, Mark Bransom, about the Klamath River Renewal Corporation. What is it exactly, and what authority does it have?
Yeah, so again, the Renewal Corporation was formed as an outcome of the Klamath Hydroelectric Settlement Agreement. We are an independent, incorporated nonprofit. We're fully funded to implement the projects. We have two sources of funding that I'll speak about. One, Craig mentioned this, and that is that Pacific Corp customers paid into a surcharge on their electric bills. Those customers contributed roughly $200 million to the project. And the second bucket of funding comes from the California Proposition 1 Water and Environmental Bond passed by voters back in the 2014 timeframe. That amounts to about $250 million. And then we have some additional contingency funds. So we have on the order of $500 million to implement the project. And that includes running the Klamath River Renewal Corporation, obtaining all the permits and necessary authorizations, and then paying for the actual removal of the dams and the restoration activities. That restoration work is expected to go out until probably 2028 or 2029. And so we've managed to figure out how to do this project within the amount of money that's been made available to us. We have a very small staff, and we run basically as a program management entity. We're responsible for the recruitment and retention of not only our staff, and I have some of the most amazing staff anywhere in the world working on this unique project, but then also ensuring that we have the right contractors focusing on the right things at the right time to get here. And we've had an amazing team of people that have been working over the last year, since roughly 2016, 2017, to ensure that we were ready to go at the earliest possible moment. And so that's really been the focus of the Renewal Corporation. We are a single mission, single purpose entity, focused exclusively on the removal of the dams and the restoration activities. And then we will dissolve. We will hit a glide path probably in the 27, 28 timeframe, and our board of directors will dismantle. We will file our last audit reports and monitoring reports, and then we will sunset. It's important, I think, to mention here, Len, that we're the current stewards of almost 8,000 acres of land, in addition to the 4 dams and all of the hydroelectric facilities. Those lands will be turned over to the states of Oregon and California, or to their third-party designees. And those lands must be preserved for public benefit, and that will include recreational uses and open space, fish and wildlife habitat. And so the public is going to enjoy a tremendous uplift in opportunity to appreciate the restoration activity post-dam removal. And so a big part of what the Renewal Corporation has been focusing on is exactly how we will restore those lands to enhance fish and wildlife habitat and recreation opportunities and the like, in anticipation of those lands then being turned over basically to the public, stewarded by the states of Oregon and California. And it's highly likely that there will be tribal entities that will have some of their historic lands returned. And we've been making a contribution to those efforts and that likely outcome as well. So there's a little bit about the Renewal Corporation, who we are, and what it is that we're up to.
That's great. If you're just joining us, my guests are Mark Bransom, Craig Tucker, and Mark Rockwell, who have all been involved in one role or another in the project to remove 4 dams from the Klamath River in Northern California, which is going to be the largest dam removal project, as I understand it, in U.S. history. So not the only one, but the largest so far. Mark, what's the governing structure of the Klamath River Renewal Corporation?
Yeah, so again, we're an independent nonprofit governed by a board of directors, and we work closely with the signatories to the amended Klamath Hydroelectric Settlement Agreement. So while we are in an independent registered nonprofit corporation, with a board of directors, we work in very close coordination and cooperation with the states of Oregon, California, Pacific Corp, the tribes, Mark Rockwell's group, and many other conservation organizations and others who are signatories to the settlement agreement. So we have our own bylaws, articles of incorporation, just like any nonprofit corporation would. We convene our board of directors and the various committees thereof on a regular basis. We do annual audits. We file our 990s for transparency. So we operate essentially just like any other nonprofit organization that you would be familiar with, perhaps with the exception that we are sort of pre-funded. We came into existence with a certain amount of capital available to us, and we have then figured out the best way to utilize that capital to complete the project as envisioned. And so we've been undertaking all the regulatory requirements since 2017. And getting us to this point now where we're ready to mobilize our contractors and actually see things start to happen on the ground.
Terrific. This is, to me, a pretty epic event to have a river that's been essentially captured, set free again, at least 400 miles of it, to have natural flows, both of the river itself and its tributaries, and restoration of the shoreline where there have been construction of the dams and powerhouses themselves, but also the areas inundated by the reservoirs behind them. That's a lot of area, and as you mentioned, that's I think you said 8,000 acres. That's going to be returned to public use in another form. So, what would you say? As we look forward, there are other dams that are essentially, they're facing problems with many dams in the West that either need an enormous amount of work to continue operating as they are now, or they're going to come down, and it's going to be one or the other. And there's probably conflicting interests. Some will want to see them, brought up to, upgraded so they can continue operation, and some would likely like to see them come out. What's the significance of this project for future dam removal?
Well, I think the Klamath, more than an example of dam removal, I think it's an example of how a small group of really dedicated people can change the world, right? It doesn't really matter what the problem is, but folks took this on decades ago, fought tooth and nail to protect their communities, protect their culture, to fight for something they believe in. So it's really that story first and foremost. But it does, I think it does influence the future of river restoration in this country and abroad. I think the lessons, you mentioned the Elwha, there were a lot of lessons learned on the Elwha that we brought to Klamath. And I think there's going to be a lot of lessons learned on Klamath that will be taken to the Columbia, to the Eel River here in California, just south of us. I think the Eel River is a place where we are very likely to see another significant dam removal to restore California's salmon and steelhead fisheries in coming years. So I definitely think every time we do this, we learn something. The thing that's was a struggle for me through this whole process is we talked a lot about how these dams don't make very much electricity. These dams don't provide flood control. These dams don't make money. So why did it take 20 years? If these are deadbeat dams, why would it take so long? And I do think, America, the philosophy or the ideology of manifest destiny really drove the settling of the West and really drove the colonization of the Americas. And I think these dams in some way represent that in a lot of people's minds. So these are emblems of our ability to control nature, to manipulate the natural environment. They look like success to people. And so I think some of the opposition to dam removal is purely ideological and kind of touches back to that philosophy or ideology of manifest destiny. And I think that's changing. I mean, I think today there's a whole movement about land back to tribes that's a contrast to that manifest destiny. So I think we are looking for new ways to do things. I think we're redefining restorative justice. We are finally viewing these environmental battles through a lens of social justice. And I think that's looking forward, thinking about how we want to do business in America and here in the West. I think the Klamath gives some instruction on how to do that.
I would just like to add on to Craig's comment too, that people ask me all the time, how could you work on this for 20 years? It seems like such an insurmountable amount of time to be focused on something like that. And, the reality of it is, to me, working with the people that we work with, Craig Tucker and Mark Branson and hundreds of others, tribal leaders and other environmental groups and agricultural community representatives and counties, through the months and years of the dialogue and negotiations going back and forth, we got to know each other. And when you get to know each other, you realize that, those people are not much different than us. And if we could all work for the benefit of each other and give at times for the benefit of somebody else and then they give at times when it's our benefit. You learn that through interpersonal communication and being with each other. And we don't have enough of that, I think, these days, to learn that, we all want to raise our family and have a good life and do the things that we do in a way that's in balance as much as we can. And I know farmers and ranchers love the land. They want the land to be there. They want the wildlife to be there. But we've got to be able to carve out a destiny for all of us that works for all of us. And that's what we've done in the Klamath, I believe. The upper basin is still going to struggle with water, not because these dams are staying in or coming out, because it's just the way it is with the time of climate change. We're unhappy about that. We would do something if we could, but we can't make it rain. But we can provide as much help and support to them as they have provided to us over this time. And I think getting to know each other and this process of dialogue and discussion was really important in getting to a conclusion that comes to the dam removal process. So you find that enemies really aren't as big an enemy as you think they are. So, we're all just good folks.
Well, thank you for that.
Even Craig and Mark.
Well, I want to thank all three of you, Mark Rockwell, Craig Tucker, and Mark Bransom. We're out of time, but I really appreciate your time here on the station, and especially just want to say, all respect and honor for the work that you've done to bring this project to fruition, and to all those who've participated. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show, and thank you for your contribution.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn.
Thanks.